Okay, I think we'll make a start. So welcome everybody to this Counterfire educational. Hopefully most of you joined us for the first session, which is a really interesting discussion on Marxism and imperialism. Today's topic is capitalism and class consciousness, and we've got Chris Nineham joining us to discuss. We are obviously living in increasingly dangerous and perilous times with rampant imperialism nakedly on display, driven ruthlessly by the capitalist and ruling class, as they subject societies abroad to death and destruction without pause or conscience, whether it be through bombs or economic sanctions, and at home they repress and subjugate society to ever-diminishing conditions of welfare and means of survival. To manufacture consent for the status quo, we witness propaganda and the stoking of division carried out by the media and political elites. The othering and dehumanization of sections of our society is purposefully carried out in an attempt to stifle any recognition of commonality between the struggle of the oppressed and the working class globally. We have seen the rise of both nationalism and fascism as a result of these concerted efforts, and the playbook is well known. However, we've also seen the rise in class consciousness ignited by solidarity with the Palestinian cause and the worldwide opposition to the genocide, whether it be the mass mobilization here in the UK with the largest sustained protest in our history, to the Italian dock workers refusing to load ships with weapons destined for Israel, or the people taking to the streets in Minneapolis to defend their communities against the violence of ICE. More and more people are making those connections and realizing the power we hold to make the vital changes towards a more fair, equal, and just world for us all. So here to discuss this topic of capitalism and class consciousness, I will welcome Chris Nineham, and over to you, Chris.
Thank you very much, Lauren, and yeah, great to see you all. Thanks for coming. I think tonight's session goes to the heart of some of the points that Lauren raised, but central set of debates that will keep on coming up on the left and more widely. And they concern aspects of Marxism that are actually quite rarely discussed and rarely understood. Marxism, unlike really any other method, explains both why there is always resistance to capitalism, but also why that struggle is uneven, why it is partial, and why it doesn't automatically lead to system change or to successful revolution. And this set of analyses are an instance of the fact that Marxism is not just a moral critique. It's not just a condemnation of capitalism and aspects of the system. Moral critiques are useful, they can be important in pointing out injustices, but they don't lead us down a path of understanding how we get change, of actually leading to changing society. And Marxism was a fundamental breakthrough when it emerged, when Marx and Engels were writing in the middle of the 19th century. It was a fundamental breakthrough precisely because it roots change, it roots a strategy for transformation in the contradictions of material reality. It examines how this potential, how these contradictions can play out, and draws programmatic conclusions from that material reality. That's why it's called materialism. And that's why it was, in a sense, intellectually revolutionary, as well as being a pointer to how revolution can happen in the real world. So let's get to the point. Marxism understands first that capitalism creates some level of popular opposition at almost all times, at all times, in fact, and sometimes creates massive upsurges of resistance and revolution. This is fundamentally because of the fact that it is a system driven by exploitation, the extraction of profit from workers. When we go to work, we get paid considerably less than the market values of the goods we produce. And this is the systematic robbery that is the core of the system that drives capitalism forward. Now, there are obviously, and it's very clear today, connected aspects of the capitalist system, including imperialist war, including racism, including women's oppression and many other things that engender resistance. But the exploitation of workers is a product of the central drive of the system to subordinate everything in society to the search for profit. This is the fundamental source of all the problems that capitalism has and all the problems that it creates for us. And this exploitation creates both class consciousness and class struggle. First of all, class consciousness through the lived experience of working people. At all times, we grasp at some level that that working people are being fundamentally done down, that working people are oppressed and exploited in society. Pay is kept below inflation, hours get longer and longer at work, redundancies keep on coming while workloads go up, bosses get more and more draconian, and so on and so forth. Combined with a kind of general discrimination against workers in society, general oppression of working people in society, these experiences themselves create class consciousness, actually much more than is normally recognised. I think probably people have heard this before, but pretty much 60% of the population in Britain identify themselves as working class. And that's a figure that hasn't changed much over the last few decades. And I think it'll come as a surprise to some people, because the media and academia tend to generate this idea that, you know, working class consciousness is something that's has dissipated or even disappeared. Absolutely not true. In general, it's not just the case that the vast majority or the majority of people self-identify as working class. It's also the case that despite the caricatures, on most issues, working class people are more left-wing than any other group in society. Working class people support trade union rights more than any other group. They support more taxes on the rich more than any other class. They support more spending on the NHS and welfare more than other classes, and so on and so forth. So just the experience of being working class in capitalist society creates a rudimentary, a basic class consciousness. The second point, though, which is very important, is that the experience of going to work and being exploited and oppressed in this way creates not just class consciousness, but also class-based resistance. It creates trade unionism, it generates strikes, associated protests, demonstrations against cuts, and again, as I said, sometimes uprisings and revolutions. The level of resistance, the level of struggle varies over time, varies amongst different sections of the working class, but particularly when they are intense, particularly when they lead to really big strikes or really big struggles and certainly uprisings, they sharpen class consciousness enormously. I think we all know that demonstrations in themselves have an empowering effect. Strikes and general strikes take people even further. As Lenin said, one day of a general strike is worth a lifetime of elections in terms of its politicization and its effect that it has on people's understanding of the world and consciousness. In a strike, you learn who your friends are, you learn who your enemies are. In a big strike, you very often learn something about the state and how the state operates against working people. You learn about the media, you learn about the police, you learn about the ruling class in general. You also, in a big struggle of this kind, you also learn about the need to overcome divisions along gender, race lines. You sense your collective power. And actually, in the process of sensing your collective power, you're confronted with your actual role in society. You learn, or when you learn, that you can stop the process of profit by taking strike action, you are at the same time learning the opposite, that you are actually essential to the process of production and therefore essential to the way that society operates. And that's what a very high level of class consciousness looks like. A real recognition of class at this kind of level implies an understanding of the role of different classes in the process of not just the process of production, but more widely in the way that capitalism works. It is a system then seen clearly as it can be seen only actually from the point of view of the working class. That's what a high level of class consciousness looks like. So that's the first and sort of important starting point. The other aspect of this, the other side of this discussion is, as I mentioned before, the fact that class consciousness develops in a partial, uneven way. It varies over history. It's different in different sections of the working class. And for these reasons, it's also true that it's not that the achievement of a full or high level of class consciousness is not spontaneous. It's not automatic. It's not something that simply flows just from the experience of living under capitalism. And this is because there is a second side to the experience of life under capitalism. The most common explanation, I reckon, on the left for the fact that much of the time working people accept the system as it is, don't struggle against the system, kind of, you know, reluctantly accept the status quo and so on and so forth. The most common explanation for that, I think, is the influence of media, maybe the influence of education. And this is important. It's true, Marx recognised it, Engels talked about it. The ideas in any given society are likely to be the ideas of the ruling class because the ruling class owns the media, owns what Marx called the means of intellectual reproduction. But seeing this as the main way in which struggle is inhibited and consciousness is kept under limitation is actually problematic. I think there's a logical problem with it, because if you see ideology as the key to the way that people are forced to accept society and fail to understand the world, you're not able to understand why it is that class consciousness varies over time, why it is that there are times of massive explosions of resistance and class struggle. So, and nor are you able to understand why there is a kind of mix, a contradictory class consciousness in people's minds, why there are why people hold radical ideas on the one hand and not so radical ideas on the other. In other words, I don't think that the kind of media explanation explains what exists all of the time under capitalism, which is a contradictory consciousness. And for Marx, although, as I say, he was quite clear about the importance of ideology, ever the materialist, he looked mainly to the reality of working class life to explain the complexities of how consciousness develops and how it operates. Exploitation breeds resistance. But it is also true that there are other elements of capitalist existence and capitalist reality that discourage resistance and obscure underlying realities. The biggest block, actually, to the development of a rounded, militant, radical class consciousness is actually alienation. The fact that workers lack control over the production process, the fact that the production process appears to be operating completely independent of us, that although it's true that we produce everything in society, we have no control over that process of production. And this profoundly affects, Marx argued, the way we see it and understand it. The drive to maximize profits leads to an extreme and inhuman division of labour, which is one aspect of this. It leads to this ruthless discipline, to the regulation and monitoring of every movement of our lives at work, and a feeling that, and a reality that we have no control over this central phenomenon of capitalist existence, the way things are produced, not just profit, but the way goods themselves are produced, the way the production process works. And this has a huge effect on our understanding, or our experience of capitalist reality. It encourages passivity, it encourages a sense of powerlessness, and in a sense an inability. It inhibits our ability to understand the overall nature of the process of production in which we're all involved. The division of labour creates this sectionalism about even our work lives. Outside of work, first of all, workers' labour itself is turned into a commodity. We're paid a good deal less, as I say, than the value that we produce. But because the capitalist only makes good on that value when the commodity is produced reaches the market, and because the market appears to operate quite independently of human agency, that robbery is a lot of the time hidden from us. The contract that we have with our employers appears to be fair to both sides because it is determined by market rates. And this, as I say, conceals the robbery at its heart. And this process, which is connected to alienation, but Marx called reification, the turning of everything into things, into commodities, it affects everything, it affects every aspect of our life. And it takes its purest form, actually, in money, which Marx called the universal pimp. As he says, when we enter the market, even if we're workers, when we enter the market, when we buy a loaf of bread and we're in a shop with a millionaire who does the same, we appear in this act to be simply buyers. Just in respect of them, the grocer or the shop owner appears to be only a seller. All other aspects of the process that produce the bread and that line the pockets of the millionaire but keeps us poor are extinguished, are concealed in this moment. The content of these purchases, like their extent, here appear irrelevant when compared with their formal aspect. So that's Marx describing the way in which the market and market relations conceal the underlying exploitation, or can conceal the underlying exploitation that is at the heart of capitalism. So the point here is that there are important aspects of capitalist reality that obscure the robbery, that atomize workers, that hinder the development of clear class consciousness, and that taken together can generate an overwhelming sense of powerlessness that Marx called alienation, a sense that there is nothing that we can do to change our circumstances, that reality is something that happens to us, that we're unable to influence, that is fundamental. And this really is the sort of the key, actually, to the ability of the capitalist class to continue despite resistance. It is the soil in which individualistic ideas of the ruling class can take root. So to come to a conclusion, it's about resolving these two different aspects of capitalism and the way in which it impacts on workers' consciousness. We've seen, despite the alienation, I talked about the way in which exploitation leads to resistance, sometimes on a massive scale, from time to time, can generate revolutionary situations. At the same time, it's very important to make the point, and this is something that George Lukács does. George Lukács was a Hungarian Marxist who in the 1920s developed Marx's ideas about alienation and reification to their fullest extent, and developed a kind of analysis of class consciousness that's never really been superseded. And one of the points that he makes is that even at times of massive class struggle and big levels, high levels of resistance and deep crisis for the capitalists, the hold of the old ideas, the assumptions and the organisations of the old that existed at times of, or developed at times of greater capitalist stability, are not completely broken. What happens in those moments of very big upsurge and crisis is there's an ideological crisis in the working class. Workers still remain caught up in capitalist ways of thought and feeling, but at the same time there are other pressures that are pushing them in other directions. But the reason why the old ideas still maintain some hold is because the unevenness in class consciousness, even when class consciousness rises, the unevenness, the reification and alienation, and the sense of powerlessness is not overcome in a spontaneous, unified way. As Marx put it, the past, even then, weighs like a nightmare on the minds of the living. And the way this plays out, most importantly, is that the established organisations of the working class, the trade unions, the reformist parties, and so on and so forth, they don't evaporate overnight. They don't disappear. They're organisations that were shaped by the alienation and the reification of capitalist life, and they don't just disappear at times of revolutionary struggle. They, in fact, actively work in these circumstances to try and ensure that spontaneous actions of the working class remain on the level of spontaneity and don't go further and don't move in the direction of revolution. Trade unions, of course, remain essential in these circumstances as the basic units of working class organisation, and their reach will be decisive. But working class politics can't be reduced simply to the question of building union strength. Unions are deeply shaped by their role in capitalist society. They're sectional. They reflect the divisions that exist in the process of production. They're based on negotiation on the terms of exploitation rather than the abolition of exploitation. And in general, certainly the leaderships of trade unions will oppose calls for workers' control and the root and branch transformation of society, while their political twins, the reformist political organisations, will continue to have a strong influence, and they'll be promoting gradualism and electoralism and compromise in these moments. So those are the reasons why, in the classical Marxist tradition of Marx and Engels and Gramsci and Lenin and Luxemburg and so forth and others, and Lukács in the 20th century tradition, took the view that the full development of class consciousness requires specific revolutionary organisation. The existence of exploitation, the existence of resistance against capitalism takes workers a long way at certain moments, but it never can take the whole of the working class towards to a full recognition of the need for revolutionary action. That's why you need revolutionary organisation designed to hold on to and develop the insights gained by the most conscious workers at the height of struggles, aimed at generalising them as widely as possible to overcome sectionalism and gradualism and challenge the passivity that comes from alienation. And this isn't just a question of technically preparing a revolution or of just spreading socialist propaganda, although those are important. It's also about the development of revolutionary leadership in the mass movements in the here and now as a means towards popularising revolutionary ideas and revolutionary methods at a time of crisis. To, in Lukács's words, to accelerate the maturing of the revolutionary tendencies that exist under capitalism by its actions. So, if you think about it, a workers' revolution, which involves the clash of huge social forces, it involves a confrontation and a challenge to a very, very established, strategic and experienced ruling class. A workers' revolution cannot happen, cannot be anything other than conscious. It requires its own organization. It requires its own leadership, specifically focused on the problems and challenges raised by the task of fundamental social change. It won't happen without that organization, even if it is driven by the realities of capitalist life. And we cannot wait until the kind of turmoil of revolutionary crisis reaches a peak to create this organization. Its basis needs to be constructed in the here and now. And, you know, I don't want to exaggerate it, but we are in a period where there is an ideological crisis in the workers' movement. Literally, that is the case. Very, very vividly and very, very explicitly. A key task for the left is to make sure that the revolutionary pole of attraction becomes more visible, more dynamic, and more accessible in short order in this period